And friends, our scripture lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 38. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly, and Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Well, those of you who have worshiped in different kinds of churches, maybe you were raised in a different faith tradition from Presbyterianism, have seen churches that probably have different styles of cross on their walls. One is called a crucifix. It's a cross that has a figurine of Jesus on it. It's most commonly found in Roman Catholic churches because there is an emphasis in their worship on the suffering of Christ, of the passion of Christ, okay? And that is commemorated in the Eucharist, which is celebrated every week. In Protestant churches, it's more customary to have an empty cross. So it's just called a cross, where the emptiness of the cross symbolizes the resurrected Christ who has gone beyond death and ascended to heaven. And so these two things symbolize something different about Christ, and both are very much valid. I've often thought that maybe churches should have a combination of the two, because particularly during the season of Lent, we are focused more on the suffering Jesus, the Jesus who is headed toward the cross. And so sometimes I think that maybe what we should be doing is having a crucifix during Lent and maybe have the empty cross the rest of the time. This journey toward suffering is something which was a difficult concept for people in Jesus' time to understand for a God or a godly person. Sometimes we still don't understand why godly people, why good people would suffer. And so when Jesus begins to teach that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, this is something that's very difficult for them to hear. This is something that Peter particularly cannot really abide by. And so it says a couple verses later that Peter pulls Jesus aside, who's been teaching this openly, and says, "Jesus, you can't be talking about this." It says that Peter rebukes Jesus. Now, why does Peter have such a reaction to it? It's not just about the idea that Jesus, this person whom he loves, is going to suffer, but it's about what it represents. It's about this idea that they could not have conceived of a godly person or a God suffering, because the idea was that the good did not suffer. The idea was that if you were good, you avoided suffering. Suffering was something for the evil, for the bad, for the weak. And when you start to associate suffering with those things, when you start to associate suffering with the bad, the evil, or the weak, you end up in a place that Jesus zeroes in on when he talks to the people in this passage, and he says, "Those who are ashamed of me," those who are ashamed of me, because he zeroes in on this idea that shame is a factor here. This idea that as he's going to suffer and be crucified, he's going to be diminished, that there's going to be this loss of status that they don't understand. And so he says, if you're going to be ashamed, that's wrong. All right? You can't be ashamed of this. This is necessary. But don't we fall victim to it as well? Don't we fall victim to the idea so often that suffering is something to be ashamed of? Don't we need to remember that there is no shame in suffering? I don't know who out there needs to hear this, but I'm pretty sure some of you do. Because there's so much pressure on many of us not to show suffering. There's so much pressure on many of us to always be smiling even when we're crying inside. Don't show the pain. Don't show the suffering. Because somehow if you do, you're diminished. Somehow if you do, you're less. Somehow if you do, you're not in God's favor, or you're weak, or whatever. But sometimes, not only is the suffering never something to be ashamed of, sometimes the suffering is a direct result of us standing up for things that are right. Sometimes the suffering comes because we're standing up for what is right, for what is good, even when it might not be popular. Right? The path to worthy goals usually involves struggle or suffering. Jesus is going to suffer because he won't concede to the forces of evil. Jesus is going to suffer because he's determined to achieve what he has been sent to do. And that determination to do what's right, to achieve a worthy goal, is something that often leads to struggle and often leads to suffering. And since that's something that we don't generally want in our lives, the temptation to avoid it is really strong. And so Peter tries to discourage Jesus from this choice, from this path. And when Peter says to him, when Peter rebukes him, Jesus turns around and rebukes Peter and says, "Get behind me, Satan." And Satan is this word that simply means adversary. It means one who is in opposition to you, right? Satan as in the devil, is simply God's adversary. And Jesus is saying that in rebuking me, in discouraging me from this path I need to be on, you are being my adversary. You may think that you care about me, but you think so because you're setting your mind on human things. You're looking at this situation from a human perspective. You're not looking at it from a divine perspective. If you were, you would understand the necessity of what it is that I'm doing. And instead, from your human perspective, you're trying to steer me away from my goal. And that's what makes you my adversary in this moment. You see, it is so tempting to lead someone to take the easy path. But the easy path is the temptation that will take us off the course of our lives to do something meaningful and important. It's when we're discouraged and someone tries to say, "Well, why don't you just give up?" In that moment, they're your adversary. They're telling you not to stay the course. They're asking you to give up what it is you deserve. Too often when things get hard, there are people who will suggest that we ought to give up our dreams, that we ought to surrender the vision of what could be. Because it would be easier in that moment to do so, to take the smoother path instead of the harder one. But dreams, aspirations, those are the things that make life worthy. Right? What is a life without the dream of doing something with meaning, of doing something with purpose? And so Jesus says to the people this most wonderful teaching that sounds hard, but I want to talk about it in a way that maybe will make it seem less hard, more achievable, and more meaningful. When he says, those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. That sounds hard because, we don't wake up in the morning saying, hey, I'd like to die. I hope not. So what does it mean to lose your life? Well, I want to suggest that to me, when I think about losing my life, I think about the fact that we don't do that in a moment. We don't lose our lives on the day we die. We lose our lives every day. Because every single day, you don't get that day back. All right? And so every day we wake up, every hour that we spend is an hour that we have lost. But I always like that term. How did you spend your day? How did you spend your time? Because I want to think about the time that we have using that metaphor of spending. And I want to ask, did you spend it wisely? See, spending is a form of loss. I mean, if I want a pizza, then I have to lose $10 or whatever, right? So if I want something, I need to lose something that I have. That's the way it works. And what if time is your currency? Right? What if you are indeed spending an hour, spending a day? Then what you have to understand is that as you spend it, you are buying. And the question is, what are you buying? Is it worth it? Is it worthy of what you're spending? And when we add up all of these expenditures of time, day by day, week by week, year by year, when you get to the end of your life, everything that you have spent over however many years it is, right, got you wherever it is that you end up. And wherever it is that you end up will have cost you your life. You don't lose your life on that ultimate day. You lost your life spending it day by day, week by week. And the only thing we can do is reach the end of our lives and ask ourselves, did we spend our lives wisely? Did we lose our lives in the service of something meaningful, in the service of something good? After all, look at what Jesus says. He says, for what will it profit them? There's that spending kind of metaphor. What will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Right? What will it profit them if what you did is you forfeit your life, you gave up your entire life in order to gain the things of the world? Is that profit? I mean, what do you have? We all know the saying, you can't take it with you. So if that's what you spent your life getting, you end your life having spent your life, having lost your life for nothing. But you can spend your life wisely so that we can get to the end of our lives and ask ourselves this question, what was the profit of our lives? Did we spend well? Was the suffering, the struggle that we went through worth it? Did we spend our days taking the path that might have been harder in order to get to that place where we did things that were more meaningful? Were we willing to endure to get to a place that would make the suffering worthwhile? Did we spend our time building others up? Did we spend our time so that the important things in life gained and were increased? Did we show love? Did we show kindness? Because I think that when we put those out into the world, those things don't die when we do. It stays. The love remains. The kindness remains. Those whom we built up continue to do great things. Those whom we encourage to stay the course, to endure the hardship, to get past the suffering. They go on to do wonderful things. And the time we spent doing it was time well spent, because it led to a meaningful kind of profit. So I encourage you to look at your lives and remember, today you're spending a day of your life. What would it mean to spend it wisely? The next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. What would it mean to spend them wisely? So that when you get to the end of that time, you look back and say, I lost that time. But look at what I gained. Look at the love that I gained. Look at the kindness. Look at the friendships. Look at the relationships. Look at the goodness that came because I was willing to lose my life for the sake of what is good. Amen.